Welcome, everyone, to this event with the Journal of the Oxford Graduate Theological Society. My name is Tim Middleton. I'm the editor of the journal, and I'm joined today by two other members of the editorial board, Natasha Chawla and James Lorenz. The journal is run by graduate students from the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, and we publish peer-reviewed scholarly articles and book reviews across the various subdisciplines of theology and religion. The journal is published under a Creative Commons license, so it's free to access on our website, JOGTS.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter at the JOGTS. And we're delighted to be talking today to Professor Alan Macfarlane on the theme of crisis and in connection with his forthcoming autobiographical work, Magic and Modernity. Alan's an historian and anthropologist, emeritus professor of anthropological science, and a Life Fellow of King's College, Cambridge. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Alan. Do you want to start us off by giving us your short introduction to this theme of crisis?
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you all for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back in Oxford, even if virtually, and on this wet March day. I thought that the most useful thing perhaps would be to explain how crises are perennial, that your crises that you're facing are no different from the crises I faced about 50 years ago when I was at Oxford. And so I thought what I'd start with doing is just to outline a few of the crises which I had exactly at your age when I was doing my DPhil at Oxford in the 1960s. And the message at the end, which I'll give you at the beginning too, is that if anything, the crises are less bad now than they were when I was at Oxford, and also that there are perfectly good and easy solutions to most of them if we just thought a moment. So what were my crises? Well, the first was, I think the deepest, was an existential crisis in my relation to religion, because I'd been brought up not in a particularly religious household, but I was influenced by Christianity quite strongly as a child and growing up. And I also inhabited a world which I now look back on as enchanted, a world where things were connected with each other, nature and culture and different parts of my life. And I could go off into imaginary worlds with animals and so on. So those of you who know Wordsworth, my life was very like Wordsworth's, because in fact I lived in the valley where Wordsworth grew up for 15 years, Hawkshead. And so I grew up enchanted, but gradually through later years of my undergraduate, and then particularly at Oxford, and particularly my third year as an undergraduate, I felt that reason and rationality meant that I could no longer hold my life together in that way. My life was becoming separated and fragmented. Later, I discovered this was the great problem of later 19th century sociology. It's the problem that Marx faced with alienation, Durkheim faced with anomie, and above all, my hero, Max Weber, faced with the idea that we have a terrible choice. We can either have enchantment and magic and an integrated life, or we can have a rational, wealthy, modern scientific existence, but we can't have both. And he talked about the famous iron cage in which we end up, which is very similar to Wordsworth's idea of alienation. So I went through that, and I've now found a solution to this problem at last, but it's been the life theme of my work, and it's the theme of the autobiography that was mentioned. So that was one main problem. A second one was that having been brought up as a Christian, but born in India, the influence of my mother, who was increasingly a Buddhist, and reading a little bit of anthropology and more of it, I came to question monotheism. I felt, how was it possible that God would have designed a world in which there was only one truth? So first of all, I questioned Christianity as a monotheistic creed, as explaining everything. But then later, of course, the other monotheisms it applies to too, Islam and Judaism. And I asked my Christian friends, what happens to the Chinese who have never heard of Christ? And they said, well, they're damned. And I couldn't accept this. And I think this was a problem for me personally then, but it's one of the big existential problems I think now in the world, which is that the dominance of the West, and hence of Christianity and the monotheistic creeds, is giving way to a more polytheistic world where the influence of India and China and Japan and so on is much more powerful. And so the question really is, how are monotheisms and polytheisms going to live side by side? So that was the second problem. The third set of problems was about pain, because I couldn't reconcile the God I'd been taught was omnipotent and had created the universe with the levels of suffering that I saw around me. I read books by C.S. Lewis on the problem of pain and so on, but I just couldn't find a solution to that. And there was a lot of pain around at that time. War, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis and the possibility that the whole world would be annihilated. My own area in Assam had just been invaded by the Chinese at the end of 1962. The Vietnam War was just starting in 1964. And so war was everywhere. Famine also. There were serious famines. The greatest famine of the 20th century was just ending when I was in my third year. That is the great leap forward of Chairman Mao. We didn't know about it, but 40 million people had just died. But there was also a famine in Bangladesh and so on. So the world was filled with war, famine, and of course, a lot of disease. So that was another problem. Another problem was ecological. Many people think that the ecological movement and the worries about destruction of the natural environment is a recent awareness. But in fact, at that time, in the mid-60s, we were very concerned about that, and particularly about the population problem. There were books coming out called The Population Bomb and so on. And there was a lot of work by people like Paul Ehrlich on the relations between humans and nature. So we were really worried about population problems. Now, the reaction to all these sorts of problems, the disintegration of meaning and all the rest of it, at that time, one set of reactions, which is, I think, a problem you're facing too, was fundamentalism. The way to eliminate contradiction and separation and loss of meaning is to reduce everything to some basic structuring fundamental, which will then explain everything and give everything a sense and a meaning. And you can get this fundamentalism in all sorts of forms. You can get it in economic fundamentalism of a free trade kind, or you can get it in religious fundamentalism of the left or the right of various monotheistic and other religions. But the form of fundamentalism we particularly faced at that time was political fundamentalism. This was, I mean, again, even I was surprised when I was looking this up today, that fascism was alive and well in Southern Europe for some 10 years after I was at Oxford. It was only in 1974 that Spain threw off the fascist yoke, and Greece and the colonels were just soon coming into power. So Southern Europe was still fascist, and the fascist overwhelming of Europe was very recent memory. But of course, the main worry was left-wing fundamentalism. We didn't know much about China and Chairman Mao, and we possibly would have been more worried if we had known more. But there was certainly the Soviet Union, which was a great existential threat to us all. So we were worried about all sorts of crises. I mean, this is the nature of human beings. They live in the present mainly, and they think that whatever they're facing is unprecedented. But perhaps the last things I can end on is that having lived for nearly 80 years and looking back 50 years over my life and reading my letters and diaries and writing my autobiography, I can see that these things fluctuate, and that the present crises are certainly no worse than they were. There's lots of statistics to show that war as a killer of human beings is far less a disaster at the moment than it was as a proportion of human population than it was in the 60s. Famine, well, we keep saying it's nearly gone, but it's certainly not as large a problem as it was again in the 1960s. Disease, we have an amazing control of. It may seem strange to say this in the middle of or the end of COVID, but on the whole, the number of infants that die and the longevity of life is entirely different. I mean, when I was at Oxford, most people would expect to die on average by their late 70s or 80s, and now it's their late 90s and so on. So many of the problems, and even the ecological problems, I mean, at last we are coming to grips with these, and there are many signs that we will find a solution to these problems. I mean, it won't be what we predict, and it'll be surprising, but I'm optimistic about that. So I think the problems are no worse and largely soluble. But the one that's interested me most in my autobiography is this first one, the problem of how we can live with both sides of the coin, both efficiency, rationality, wealth, and so on, and not lose a sense of identity and a sense of meaning in our lives and a sense of enchantment and magic. And it's taken me 80 years nearly to find out the solution to that. Thank you.
Thank you. And just picking up on some of what you've said, we're going to be asking questions about those solutions. We're very much interested in that. Our first question is, how do you actually define crisis then?
I suppose, I mean, the obvious thing is that it's an extreme tipping point. It's like chaos theory. It's a moment when things come to a head. You take things as a normal tendency and trend, and then suddenly it goes off in another direction, which is unpredictable. That's one of the main features of it, that most of our lives we can predict what's going to be happening tomorrow or the day after. But when there's a perturbation, and of course it can be physical, it can be mental, it can be anything. I suppose it's the suddenness and the unpredictability, and also the feeling that you've lost control and that you don't know what the solution is. And if you bring all those things together, then you get a crisis.
And something that comes out in your autobiography is this kind of connection between your own personal crisis of disenchantment and a kind of societal process of disenchantment. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that connection is between the personal and the societal there.
Well, it's been a theme of a lot of my work that many academics think that you can understand ideas in a disembodied way, that if you look at their development of a great thinker, you can write a biography of someone just as a biography of a kind of brain. Now, I've increasingly felt this is nonsense, and even people who look very rationalist, like Descartes, if you read the Discourse on Method, he said, this is a history of my mind, and he said he was going to call it, this is a history of my life, because basically we are animals and we receive information and we process information through the whole of our body and so on. So our life and our work cannot be separated at all. It's normally very difficult to actually investigate this because most people who write their autobiographies are doing it through memory, and therefore they just remember the ideas and so on. Because I can reconstruct my life, because I didn't throw anything much away from the age of 15 or 16, my volumes are filled with what I was eating, where I was going, who I was interacting with, letters to my friends and girlfriends and so on. So I can see the coalescence. And later in the account of Enchantment, it's quite clear that if I hadn't gone to Nepal and found another enchanted, magical world, and then gone on to Japan and then China, the experience, in a way, it's central to anthropology. As you probably know, the method of anthropology is called participant observation. And I've recently come to realize that's the method of human beings, that from the moment you're born, how do you learn about the world? You learn about it through participant observation. And that participation is not largely even through language or conscious rational thought. It's through physical absorption and experiences. So you both experience heat and cold and love and hate, but you also think about them at the same time. So we are all born anthropologists, and it's the interaction between them. So very small chance things like a certain person you meet or a certain place you go to affect all that you are. And so there are many things I can't really understand. There are many things probably going on in Oxford at that time which were influencing me indirectly in my trajectory, but I can see how much my experiences as an undergraduate and then postgraduate and then going to these countries shaped me.
You've talked a lot about moving from a magical and enchanted world to a more rational but less meaningful world. Do you think that in this post-disenchanted world that you describe, that it's an individual's duty to formulate their own reference of meaning, or especially now that there's a breakdown of traditional religious beliefs, would you envision there being a need for new traditions to be formed?
It's not just a need. We're constantly forming new traditions. There's a lot of literature in anthropology about the invention of tradition. We have to live within traditions. We are animals that need our social and imaginative lives, and we are constantly renewing them because the old ones become stale or we no longer accept them. So every day that we wake up, we invent new traditions and ideas and so on. And that is very important. In relation to the first part, I think self-awareness. I was always struck by the idea of John Stuart Mill about how we can understand our lives. And he said that the sources of knowledge about life and about the middle level tendencies or structures which affect our lives are learnt from two main sources. One is from history. One is from looking at what happened in the past, which doesn't repeat itself, but you see patterns of certain kinds. And the other is from self-awareness and interrogating yourself. And that's clearly what Descartes was doing, and most philosophers do. So there are various ways of speeding this up or making it more efficient. For example, keeping a diary, any kind of externalization of yourself. Writing, I find, is one of the ways, and other people have other art forms. But if you can stand back from yourself, externalize who you are and what your problems are, that often makes them explicit. Because as soon as, and this is another theme of my work, as soon as you understand a problem, either historically or in your own life, then you can usually think of a way out of it. It's the confusion and muddle that you're in before you actually locate it. And this is why understanding modernity and understanding that it is a tension between different parts of our lives, between the economic and so on, economic, political, religious, intellectual, that tension and separation is what I define modernity to mean. Now, as soon as you realize that everyone faces this, it's not a, you're not the only one who feels this, and that it is actually built into the structure of modern societies. Being in Oxford, you are bound to have your life torn into bits. Being in America. And as soon as you understand that it is inevitable and you can see for what it is, then you can start to address it and maybe get round it and realize that there are perfectly good solutions to this. But as long as you don't understand it and you don't understand yourself, one of my favorite poets is Alexander Pope, and one of my favorite parts of Pope is the essay on man. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man.
Thank you, Alan. My next question was going to be about the nature of disenchantment and whether you think that disenchantment is itself a form of crisis, and particularly in regard to indigenous cultures, where there's a narrative that such cultures were at one time living more peacefully and in greater harmony with each other and the environment.
Well, if it's a crisis, it doesn't quite fit into my definition because it's perennial. It's, I mean, not perennial, but certainly tens of years, hundreds of years. The location of the crisis in Europe, as I say, is the second half of the 19th century, and sociology, modern sociology and the social sciences, and to a certain extent the Enlightenment grew up out of that particular crisis, the loss of religious faith and integration. So it's not a single event crisis. But the second half, which is that when modernity of this kind, the separation occurs in a traditional society which has held things together, nature and culture and all these things, it does and can form a serious crisis. A lot of the anthropological literature on millenarianism, books like The Trumpet Shall Sound, and Burridge's work, and all those books, Peter Worsley's and others, have shown that if you go to, say, some Melanesian society, or it also happened in the North American plains, Indians and elsewhere, and you bring in Western capitalism, money values, all the things that split us apart. I mean, all the tools of civilization are separating tools like writing or money or cities or division of labor. If you bring those in, what you usually get is a reaction where you demand a solution by expelling the thing or saying, let's bring it all together. I mean, it's a pretty obvious fact that the populist movements that swept the world in the last few years, like Donald Trump or Brexit or whatever you like, these populist movements and Bolsonaro and Hungary and so on are partly a reaction to this crisis. In other words, a loss of meaning and a sense that things are getting out of hand and your identity is being threatened. And fundamentalist religion, I mean, there's also a lot of work on, for example, mission rising in South America, which shows that the growth of fundamentalist Christian churches, and also in Africa, was partly a reaction to this kind of splitting apart. And so I think there is a relationship between this. What interests me, though, is, well, one of the things that interests me is how some cultures manage to overcome it. And that was lessons I learned, for example, from Japan. Japan, on which I wrote a book, is a wonderful example of a big civilization which was faced in the later 19th century by Western power and domination, Western markets, Western everything. And it appeared it somehow absorbed the bits it wanted, but kept out the bits it didn't want. So my thesis in the book is that basically Japan is still an ancient shamanic civilization under the surface. It holds up a mirror which shows it to be modern and the rest of it. Inside, it's entirely different. Now, I think that to a certain extent, China, I thought Japan was just an exception, but to a certain extent, China is doing the same sort of thing. That it looks very modern and it looks as if it's absorbing everything in the West, but it's also retaining its inner core. So it's quite possible to do that. And I think parts of Europe do the same thing. So, but this is all right for a big civilization like China or Japan. If you're a small tribe in New Guinea and suddenly you're hit by missionaries, by markets, by outside political systems, you can become very disoriented.
In your book, you give a very interesting account of prayer. And on page 106, for example, you write that to say a Hail Mary or God is great changes the world and brings into closer touch with something beyond space and time. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts of prayer as a way of kindling enchantment and a way of transforming our perception of the world?
You've read my book more recently than I have. I'd forgotten about that. Well, I mean, anthropologists and linguists believe that words have power, that you have elocution and the actual sound of words. In other words, they are a form of magic, which is defined as a sequence, a repetitive sequence of symbols which affect the world. Now, whether it works as believers would have by putting you in touch with some other reality, or whether it affects just psychologically because you believe that, I don't know. But everyone knows you just need two words. My favorite ones are let's pretend. With my granddaughters, when they were younger, they would say, or I'd say, let's pretend we're tigers, and we were tigers. And prayer can be a device. You just say these, and then to the outsider, and that's why Protestants hated it and called it mumbo jumbo and so on and so on. But for a Catholic or a believer, it actually has the force and power to move you out of one dimension into another dimension. It unlocks another dimension. So it can be. But one of my disappointments, and one of the reasons I suppose I ended up without remaining a formal Christian, was that prayer never seemed to be echoed in any way. I went through a very evangelical, I was a member of OIQ, which you'll know, the Oxford Intercollegiate Christian Union, and so on and so on. And I was told that I could say prayers and I would feel that there was something there. I was speaking to something. But I never really felt that. I just felt I was asking or saying things. And so it wasn't very effective. But of course, even all of us pray all the time. I mean, you'll find, I'm sure, Richard Dawkins and others on a dark night when suddenly something spooky happens, or they're just about to, their car is about to crash. I'm sure Richard Dawkins throws a prayer up to heaven. I mean, it's a normal reaction to all sorts of stresses.
You mentioned earlier that after many, many years, you'd found a solution of how maybe this generation can build a world where reason and heart exist together. How do you envision?
Well, this is the surprise of writing the first volume of my autobiography in COVID, in the early months of COVID, because by externalizing the problem, by giving an account of how my life's work, a lot of my work is around the theme of disenchantment, I took myself through from childhood and through the growing up and the Wordsworthian thing to Oxford and beyond, and showed how it was quite normal and absolutely obvious that I would separate out my lives and I would lose my faith. And if I'd remained a historian, probably that's where I would be now. But by going to other cultures and getting the shock of finding worlds where magic and enchantment still exist and the head and the heart are united and things have a meaning. The first small shock, well, the shock of Nepal and then Japan and China. But the surprise in the book was having gone through this mentally in a few weeks of writing, I then came back and looked around my own world. And it's just like all the fairy stories. I'll give you just a very personal example. My beloved granddaughter, Lily, when she went into a big wardrobe in my room in King's College, which belonged to John Maynard Keynes, she went in and I said, "This is Narnia." And she said, "Oh, yes, it's very cold in here. And I can see the White Witch," and so on. And then she hopped out and she just looked round. She said, "The whole world's changed." Now, Alice in Wonderland or all these different children's stories and a lot of poetry, Keats, Ode to a Nightingale, and much poetry and literature is about how an experience into another or entering another dimension, you come back and your world is different. And so when I came back in the book and in my mind and looked around me and started to examine my life, and I'll have to be brief and I'll summarize it. If I looked at my life over 24 hours, or you looked at your lives, how much of it is lived in a cold, rational iron cage of separations and divisions? Hardly any of it. Nearly all of it. And I then analyze things like play and games, art and literature, love, even drink and so on. If you look at what you do and how you are affected by what you do, let alone the 8 hours you're dreaming, which is not rational at all, probably most people, if you watch them watching television, again, I saw this with Lily. I was reading to her when she was about 4 or 5. And the moment I said it was a cold night on the mountain, her eyes sort of looked up like this. I filmed it and I could see she was away, she was in the mountain. Now, when you read a novel, when you watch a film, when you play a game, when you watch a game, when you have a conversation with someone you like and play mental games, you are not in the cold, rational world. Human beings are really mostly imaginative creators of alternative realities. And therefore, instead of worrying that And what I called this, I thought, from another line of poetry I like from Shelley, many a green isle needs must be in the deep wide sea of misery. And I thought of the kind of enchantment which all of us fill our lives with as green islands or oases, as I sometimes describe it, in a desert. In other words, if we didn't have all these things, being rational and common sense and separating and thinking about money and thinking about our next chapter of our PhD thesis or whatever it is, or DPhil, that would be intolerable. We escape all the time into daydreams or a game of this or that. And so we haven't lost. We can combine, and that's the final chapter of my autobiography, is how it solves the problem which Max Weber put forward, and then Ernest Gellner, my teacher, was a philosopher and anthropologist, that we can be both rational, tolerant, liberal, and fairly efficient, but also live a very rich, imaginative life.
I'm wondering if we can zoom out a bit now and consider some of the kind of large-scale crises that we're facing in the world today. And you've spoken already a bit about how one of the temptations when we're faced with these large-scale crises is to collapse into a kind of fundamentalism, whether it be religious or economic or political. Are there things you think we can do to prevent that collapse into fundamentalism? In your autobiography, you talk about small-scale meaning activities, meaning-making activities. Are those the sorts of things that can prevent that collapse, do you think?
Well, I wrote a little book. I write books for young Chinese and so on, master's letters to young people. And one of them was called How Can We Survive? And in that, I took 8 current crises, the ecological one, educational one, political one, and so on. And in each one, I in the first 2/3 of the chapter, I explain what the crisis is. And then in the last third, I said, this is the solution. Now, whether other people will think it's the solution or not, I don't know. And I haven't seen a rush of politicians or others leaping to buy the book. But for me, I saw that each one was solvable. And I'll just give you one example, and that's the crisis of democracy. I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about political theory, and I'm very interested in political scientists who I got interested in Oxford, Tocqueville, and people like that. And the crisis of democracy is a simple one, which is that a system which was devised to give about 1/3 of the Greek population some kind of participation, i.e. no women, no slaves, no poor, but the 1/3 who were up there could participate in their discussions. So you've got a few 100,000 people in Athens. That was then revived and built up in other various places, including England, with a population of 4, 5, 10 million. And you could have a sense of participation and that you were being represented in some way. Now we face the problem that you have the European Union, or you have India, or you have China, or you have America. You have millions and millions, hundreds of millions, billions. How can you still feel that democracy gives you a sense of meaning? Well, my solution to this is basically to follow Tocqueville and to distinguish between 2 forms of democracy. Democracy with a capital D, meaning going and voting once every 4 years, which leads to absolute disaster, as we know. And that's why we throw out the government every 4 years, because they never do what we hope they would do. And we see it even on a larger scale in America now. I mean, anyone who thinks that what's happened in the last year or two in America has anything to do with democracy is fantasizing. So a democracy of that kind doesn't work very well. But Tocqueville said, that's not what I mean when I write my great book, Democracy in America. What I mean is self-government, or feeling in charge of your own life. And what I mean in America and elsewhere is a feeling that you participate in your own fate at a much lower level. It's not totally different from Adam Smith's idea that the state is just there to do the mega things like transport or wars or whatever, but everything else should be left at a lower level. And Tocqueville said that we should devise or encourage or build up, and this is what he admired about America, a system whereby we all participate, like starting a journal of religious studies and getting friends and changing the world in that way. Whatever we do, we set up. And so democracy with a small d is perfectly possible, and it flourishes. It's what we call civil society. And the more it flourishes, the more people feel they are participating. You in Oxford have the good fortune of being members of colleges and so on, which give you a long and strong sense of this, and I've had the same privilege. But again, if you look at the life of most people actually belong to all sorts of little subgroups. And England is filled with subgroups of all kinds. Now, the more you cherish that and build that up, the more people have a sense of, okay, they can't change the mega, but they can run their own lives in the way they want to do that. And that's why when I'm asked in China what China should do to combine with the problems of running 1.3 billion people and giving people a sense of autonomy and strength, I recommend them to read Tocqueville.
So just lastly, what would be some advice you would give to all of us in trying to turn perceived crises into hope?
Into hope? Well, I tried to do this throughout the talk. Basically, here I am at the end of nearly 80 years, and the crises that I faced when I was your age are less severe than they were then. But also, they go on. There's always a new one. And if there's no crisis, you invent one. It might be, I suppose some anthropologists might say that we can't live without crises, that we know many people, you all look very stable and calm people, but we all know people who can't really survive without something, whether it's an essay crisis or a crisis in a personal relationship. It drives you on. So in a sense, we live with that, and it might be worth wondering whether religion and the kind of things you're interested in actually pushes you a bit towards this, because you're constantly questioning yourselves and the meaning of life and your faith. And therefore, things possibly perturb you a lot more than they would an average, less sensitive and less thoughtful person. So perhaps have a sheet of paper by you, and when a new crisis comes along, write it down, and then underneath say, what crisis? Okay.
That's brilliant. Professor Macfarlane, thank you. This has given us a whole new perspective on some of the larger issues we're facing today, and a more hopeful and perhaps more useful way to look at what we describe as a crisis.
Yes, be full of hope, okay?
This has been wonderfully insightful, and it's been a great privilege for the Graduate Theology Society Journal here in Oxford.
Well, can I end by wishing your journal all success?